All right, folks. Sorry for the delay on getting this lecture out to you. We are going to re-examine some points on obesity. So we're going to look at some etiology, pathophysiology, exercise, and management of diabetes, or of obesity, sorry. Some mechanisms associated with that, and then the obesity paradox. And then we'll do one slide on article-specific content for this week. I'm going to save the diabetes portion for lecture on Thursday. Okay, so before we get going, obviously can't control whether you do this or not, but I'd like to invite you to pull out a note card or a piece of paper and answer the question, does exercise increase appetite or suppress appetite? I give you just a minute. Okay, I'm assuming you haven't answered it yet. So go ahead and pause the video, finish your answer, and then press play again. Okay, so I'd like you to consider whether or not your answer was in response to acute exercise or chronic exercise, and would that change your answer? Additionally, how did you define exercise, and how did you define appetite? Okay, so I'd take a minute to consider that, and once you've come up with some answers relative to those questions, go ahead and play again. So for activity 2, we're going to look at some basic regulation. So in that process, what body organs or systems do you think are involved in regulation of appetite? Again, I'll give you just a couple of seconds for that. Okay. Again, you can pause the video if you need more time. What hormones do you think are involved in that process? Are there other factors that aren't covered in the bodily organs slash systems or hormones? And then last question, what are the inhibitors or drivers of energy intake? Again, feel free to pause the video if you'd like to continue answering these questions. There is a purpose to this. When you ask questions and make predictions, it does prepare you for learning. So there's a lot of research that shows that if you are making these sort of guesses early on, that you're more ready to learn the information coming. So this isn't me just coming up with a useless activity for you. Okay. So first we're going to talk about obesity again. So I realized in our last lecture, I didn't necessarily cover how obesity is defined. And so I did talk about it being defined by BMI, but I just wanted to go over that again. So here's your calculation. So it's weight times 703 divided by height squared. So height times height. That can also be, if you just are using kilograms, you can do kilograms per meter squared. So height squared, but in meters instead of inches. Excuse me. Okay. And then we categorize people based on their BMI score, so their weight to height ratio. We've got underweight individuals less than 18.5 as a ratio, normal weight 18.5 to 24.9, overweight as 25 to 29.9, obese as 30 and above. There is more of an effort in the research literature to split obesity into several categories. So generally speaking, this would be class 1 obesity. Greater than 35, so 35 to 40 would be considered class 2, and 40 and above would be considered class 3. Additionally, there are multiple types of obesity. So often when we talk about obesity, we're referencing polygenic obesity, meaning there are lots of factors involved. There can be some genetic factors, lifestyle factors, and ultimately when we break those apart, there are maybe an infinite number of factors to be considered. Monogenic obesity is generally related to a single chromosomal shift, and that obesity almost always manifests in childhood. I think it always does, as far as I'm aware. Syndromic obesity is associated with other conditions such as mental retardation and organ abnormalities. The two most common types are Prader-Willi and Bardet-Biedl. They're still very uncommon, but I just wanted you to be aware that they do exist. Again, those generally would be diagnosed at an early age. Oligogenic is referring to obesity that is the result of a small number of chromosomal mutations. And then, like I said, polygenic is what we generally think of as obesity. So this is a causal map for obesity. And you can see this is a mess. It's a disaster. So there are 114 different elements, so those little boxes, and more than 200 interconnections, so all of the arrows. And the individuals who created this say that it is still an oversimplification of the development of obesity. So somebody thankfully sort of broke this down a little bit further for us into societal influences, food production, food consumption, biology, individual activity, activity and environment. So those might be some general areas to start thinking about, okay, how would that maybe affect the development of obesity? But you can see it's a really complex issue. So I think about that, particularly most of you are going on to be practitioners or clinicians in some way. And obesity is very prevalent in our society, as we'll get to in a moment. It's helpful for you to have the perspective of there are a lot of factors involved in obesity development. Try not to boil it down to energy intake and energy expenditure with your client or patient. It feels very reductive and it doesn't address all of these other factors that are involved. And yes, all of these factors may be involved in the energy intake, energy expenditure equation somewhere, but when you boil that down that way to a client, it feels very reductive and like you're not seeing them as a whole person or seeing the whole situation. Okay, I know this is hard to see. Feel free to pause the video. You can pull up the PowerPoint itself and expand this. All I want you to do is take a minute to look at these associations. Generally, so white is saying that there's not enough data to look at associations. Green is generally low prevalence of obesity. And then the yellow into orange, red, and black in that order gets, you see increasing prevalence of obesity. And this is broken down by race or ethnicity. So I just want you to take a minute and look at this and see, are there geographic patterns and are there patterns associated with race? Okay, so I'm hoping that you've picked out at least a couple patterns. Um, The first of which, if we're looking at geographic location, really commonly we see literally called the obesity belt or the diabetes belt down here in this bottom right corner. So in the southeast portion of the US. And you do see generally an increased prevalence of obesity in that population. Although notice in the non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaskan Native population, we don't see that as clearly. So that may be due to, right, the uh, larger populations of Alaskan Natives or non-Hispanic American Indians in other geographic locations. In any case, the other thing I want you to, I hope that you noticed was that the non-Hispanic Asian adults seem to have the lowest prevalence. That's very consistently the case throughout the research literature, followed by non-Hispanic white adults, then Hispanic adults. And then sometimes you see flips in between whether or not non-Hispanic Black adults or non-Hispanic American Indians or Alaskan Natives have greater prevalence, but both populations tend to have quite a high prevalence. Okay, the other sort of phenotype of obesity that I want us to be aware of is the metabolically healthy obese population. And I'm hoping some of you may have heard of this population. What this refers to is that there are individuals who are normal weight and metabolically healthy, right? So their BMI is normal and they don't have dyslipidemia, hypertension, or diabetes. However, you have an obese population that also doesn't have dyslipidemia, hypertension, or diabetes. So we would consider them metabolically healthy. However, this population does still experience an increased incidence of coronary heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, so generally stroke here, and heart failure. So it can sometimes be a bit of a misnomer thinking that these individuals don't have increased health risk because they're metabolically healthy, that the research doesn't seem to hold up with that. And this was a study done on 3.5 million men and women in the UK, which is representative of about 6.2% of that population, their population, so a really large portion of the population. And there was a mean follow-up of 5.4 years. So I would consider these results pretty robust. So the metabolically healthy obese phenotype is absolutely prevalent. However, it is still associated with increased morbidity and mortality risk. Okay, so another aspect, since we're talking about sort of the metabolic health of obesity, is to consider metabolic syndrome. So with metabolic syndrome, we're going to be looking at visceral obesity that would be diagnosed with a waist circumference measurement, insulin resistance, which may be diagnosed with fasting plasma glucose test or an oral glucose tolerance test or an HbA1c test. Those may be all surrogates to look at insulin resistance or blood glucose regulation. Then you're looking at hypertension, so we're going to diagnose that using blood pressure, triglycerides, so LDL and VLDL levels, as well as triglycerides, and then low HDL cholesterol. So we could kind of combine those to look at dyslipidemia here. Those are the 5 criteria for diagnosing metabolic syndrome. So again, I could also be normal weight, but still be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. Okay, so it's again helpful when we're speaking about this to talk about a normal weight and potentially normal weight metabolically unhealthy population. So maybe a metabolic syndrome population. And then you also have the obese metabolically healthy population. So we have a couple of different phenotypes that we're dealing with here. So this is a really amazing figure. So I hope you'll take some time, maybe pause the video, look this through and see what patterns you come up with. But what this does is it takes several diseases, so coronary heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, heart failure, and peripheral vascular disease, and it breaks the hazard ratio, so your chances of contracting coronary heart disease with your weight status as well as your metabolic status. Okay, so you can see in this upper left-hand corner, we have an individual who is underweight and has no metabolic abnormalities, and their risk for coronary heart disease is extremely low. Okay, As we go from underweight to normal weight, we see risk increase a little bit, although this is your reference category. So the normal weight individual with zero metabolic abnormalities. As we increase in metabolic abnormalities, even if you're still normal weight, right, we see increased coronary heart disease risk. Similarly, with overweight population, the overweight population still has an increased risk for coronary heart disease, but their risk, if they have no metabolic dysregulation, is actually lower than that of someone who's normal weight but has metabolic dysregulation. Okay. And then again, we see as the number of metabolic dysregulations increases, the risk for coronary heart disease increases. And then lastly, if we look at an obese population with no metabolic abnormalities, you can see that their risk is actually lower than maybe everyone's except for underweight individuals with one metabolic abnormality. Okay, so relatively low risk as long as they're not metabolically unhealthy. That doesn't eliminate the risk, but it's less. So I've sort of talked you through this one. I'd like you to take a minute and see if you can look at patterns in these other three areas and what differences exist between them. So we definitely see pretty clear patterns here, right? But those patterns aren't as clear, particularly over here. Okay. Okay. So now we're going to look at physical activity and the prevention of weight gain in adults. So starting in this bottom left-hand corner, you have hours per week of vigorous intensity physical activity. And as we increase vigorous physical activity, we see a decrease in the incidence rate ratio of developing obesity. The rate ratio is the same as a relative risk, so it is a ratio of incidence rates. So the incidence rate in this case would be comparing the incidence of obesity in individuals getting 5 to 6 hours of vigorous physical activity per week to those getting 7. And you can see a pretty clear dose response association here. So as I increase every 1 hour per week, my risk for developing obesity decreases significantly for vigorous physical activity. Then we have met hours per week. So here we were looking at intensity of physical activity or volume and intensity of physical activity. Here we're looking at met hours per week. So just volume. And this is the odds ratio of maintaining healthy weight. Okay, so now we want to maintain healthy weight, right? So as met hours per week go up, we see that your chances for maintaining healthy weight also go up. The odds ratio, I know we haven't covered yet. So for odds ratios, you will see a contingency table like this. So you're going to look at an exposure and then the existence of disease or not. So you're grouped by the presence or absence of disease. And then, so you're grouped here first. And then the odds ratio communicates the odds or the prevalence of possessing the risk factor. Okay. And you can see there are some terms. So if I have the disease and the exposure, I would be a true positive. If I don't have the disease, but I do have the exposure, I would be a false negative. Okay. So the odds ratio is the ratio of A times D to B times C. And in order to get this data, you have to have a case control, or you have to use a case control study design, which is often used to study rare health outcomes or investigate associations that would be unethical to study in an experimental or prospective cohort. So, right, I'm grouping people based on disease, meaning I know already whether or not they've developed disease, and then I'm looking in the past to see if they had a risk factor. The problem with, so sometimes, right, we might say, oh, well, then that doesn't increase the likelihood of a causal association, right, or a causal relationship here. In reality, it's impossible to do an experimental design because I can't ask somebody to engage in a behavior that I know may cause disease. Okay, so that would be unethical. Similarly, even in a prospective cohort, right? if I see individuals engaging in an unhealthy behavior in my study, it's unethical for me not to give them information about how they might reduce their risk for disease. Okay, so in this case, a case control design is your best design, and it's the only design that will get you an odds ratio. Okay, so this really we're looking at prevention of weight gain. Here we're going to look at weight loss. So the ACSM position stand in 2009 was that less than 150 minutes per week doesn't promote weight loss. Greater than 150 minutes per week, you may see 2 to 3 kilograms of weight loss. And then 225 to 420 minutes per week promotes 5 to 7.5 kilograms of weight loss. Resistance exercise was negligible, right? Especially if you're looking at confidence intervals, we're not going to see a lot of weight loss associated with resistance training. So here, right, first we're looking at weight gain, preventing weight gain. Here we're looking at losing weight once the weight has already been gained. And now we're going to look at weight regain prevention. So I had excess weight, then I lost it. How active do I need to be to prevent weight regain? And what the ACSM position stand says is that you need to engage in two to 300 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. However, they also said that no properly designed, adequately powered energy balance studies to provide evidence for the amount of physical activity to prevent weight gain after weight loss, but they did say that more physical activity seems to be better at preventing weight regain. All right. So here, I think it's really helpful for you to have a perspective on other forms of weight loss and how exercise really compares. So here we have placebo-subtracted weight loss. So whenever anyone is getting any kind of intervention, there is a placebo effect. It's a very real effect. It's helpful. We can use it on ourselves a lot, right? But in research findings, we want to know that the intervention we're using is producing the result we say that it is. So generally, that's where you'd have a control group, right, that is receiving some type of a placebo intervention, and then you would have an intervention group that is receiving your intervention. So this data subtracts placebo amounts of weight loss so that we're trying to look at just weight loss associated with the intervention. And you can see that relative to any kind of pharmacologic intervention, exercise doesn't produce a large amount of weight loss. Okay, and you see these drugs come and go. So phentermine was used really significantly in the past, orlistat as well. I'm not as familiar with these three middle ones. Semaglutides are very popular at the moment. So you're looking at Ozempic and Wegovy there. And then tirzepatides, so Zepbound and Mounjaro are the two that I'm familiar with. And you can see significantly increased weight loss associated with uh, these different drugs. Okay, so exercise consistently produces less weight loss than is predicted by any given exercise intervention, right? So a couple of weeks ago, we did calculations for energy expenditure, right? I taught you how to convert METs or MET hours per week or MET minutes into calorie consumption, okay? So I could say, I could prescribe exercise and say, okay, you're going to lose this many calories per day. Therefore, in a week, you can expect this much weight loss, right? So people do those calculations and they engage in an intervention, and consistently exercise produces less weight loss than we would predict. And one of the potential reasons, so this is some research from Dr. Halliday, who's in our department, who works with obesity a lot. And it's from one of her studies, and they were looking at responders versus non-responders to exercise interventions. And one area where responders and non-responders differed was standing. What percentage of your wake time was spent standing? And comparing baseline to follow-up, responders had the same amount of standing time, but non-responders, you see this compensatory mechanism is what we might call it. So we saw that actually they spent less time standing after an exercise intervention. Okay, so one compensatory mechanism might be changes in your NEPA. which is another term. So SPA, NEAT, and NEPA all refer to the same thing. So spontaneous physical activity is SPA, NEAT is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEPA is non-exercise physical activity. So that would be your standing time. Okay. There's a theory that some individuals who engage in exercise experience a greater decrease in their non-exercise physical activity. And this study does seem to support that. So that is one of the ways in which we may see less weight loss as a result of an exercise intervention than we might expect. Dr. Halliday's done some really cool work on changes in ghrelin and GLP-1 as a result of exercise interventions. So ghrelin is a hunger hormone. So if I see an increase in ghrelin, then I would expect to be hungrier. And what we see in research studies comparing different types of physical activity is that resistance training, when compared to aerobic training or a sedentary control, decreases the presence of ghrelin. So we may see slightly decreased hunger cues. Having said that, I think it is helpful to also understand that with aerobic versus resistance training, typically you would utilize more calories during an aerobic training session as opposed to a resistance training session. So it does make sense that after an aerobic training session, you would experience greater hunger cues. In any case, one of the sort of summary conclusions from this and a couple of her other papers are that acute exercise may suppress appetite and energy intake. Chronic exercise, however, with chronic exercise, weight loss responses might be due to individual appetite differences that were present already at baseline. So, in other words, we might not be seeing really significant chronic adaptations to appetite regulation as a result of exercise. Okay, so I think it's helpful also to look at exercise modality and spot reduction. So this compared aerobic and resistance training in 97 women, and it looked at fat loss in specific areas of the body. So you can see here that resistance exercise did result after a year in slightly greater change in or slightly greater loss of fat mass in a variety of areas. When I looked at this study, if I remember right, there wasn't a significant difference between these two values in any of the areas of the body. So they're close enough that we're not seeing significant differences. The graph makes it look like there's pretty significant differences, but here you're looking at maybe half a kilo, so maybe a pound. So still not a super significant difference here. Yeah, so both were effective. So to summarize the effect of exercise on obesity, exercise can elicit weight loss, though the effects are typically modest. Increased volume of aerobic exercise increases weight loss and weight loss maintenance. Weight loss results are heterogeneous, maybe partly due to changes in appetite and or non-exercise physical activity thermogenesis. So some people may experience greater amounts of compensatory mechanisms as opposed to other individuals. So how do we think physical activity is affecting weight status? There's lots of research supporting these, but we may see improved energy balance. So just the coupling of intake and output. And so that's what some of Dr. Halliday's work focuses on, is that we think that when individuals are more highly active, that they are more aware of their hunger cues. And I believe we look at one study later today that also demonstrates that. There are anti-inflammatory mechanisms. So with exercise, we see improved vascular function, so angiogenesis and increased nitrous oxide, expression of nitrous oxide. So in that case, actually, we're really more looking at the atherosclerotic process. But in any case, the increase in mitochondrial efficiency and antioxidants. Oh, I skipped one. I'm sorry. Let's come back. Coming to anti-inflammatories, you see increased mitochondrial efficiency and quantity. So more mitochondria, and they are resolving reactive oxygen species or diminishing the amount of reactive oxygen species in the blood. So we'd expect to see decreased inflammation there. And you can see that interrupt the process of adiposopathy that we talked about last week. The improved vascular function, sorry for the change in order, right? We see angiogenesis. So actually the sprouting of new blood vessels, and increased nitric oxide expression, improved lipid handling, so increased HDL, increased uptake and use of lipids. So I have less lipids hanging out in my bloodstream, right? Because I'm utilizing them through skeletal muscle contraction. And then we see decreased visceral fat or ectopic fat storage as well. And then lastly, improved glucose management. So increased uptake and use of carbohydrates, decreased liver glucose and cholesterol production, increased insulin sensitivity. That's partly due to increased receptor activity. So during exercise, GLUT4 is translocated, and we talked about this last week, is translocated to the surface of the membrane without the presence of insulin. So I see receptors being much more sensitive to insulin, perhaps because they're already on the surface of the cell as opposed to inside the cell. And you see decreased pancreatic stress, which also makes sense, right? If I see increased insulin sensitivity, then I can reduce the amount of insulin that I'm producing, which would decrease the stress on the pancreas. Okay, really quickly, we're going to do, I think it's just one slide on nutrition in the prevention and treatment of obesity. All I really wanted to demonstrate here was they took a variety of diets and looked at weight loss across a period of months, and there was no significant difference in the macronutrient composition of the there was a significant difference in the composition of the macronutrient diets, but no significant difference in the weight loss as a result of the different diets. So as long as individuals were adherent to their diet, they experienced weight loss. And you can just look at the different ratios here. So we had carbohydrate, then protein, then fat. So 65% carbohydrate as opposed to 55, 45, and 35. So pretty significantly different diets there, but no significant difference in weight loss. So when somebody tells you that one diet is better for weight loss than another, it may be true for them or for a particular individual or even a group of individuals. But when we look at larger data sets, we typically don't see one macronutrient breakdown being superior. There may be some literature suggesting that high protein diets may be more effective, and we may look at some of that data later in the semester. Okay, and then a couple quick slides on sedentary behavior. We'll cover sedentary behavior in 2 weeks a little more thoroughly, but the ACSM's update or pronouncement, I forget that's what they call it, on the effect of the effect of sedentary behavior on weight status is that there's limited evidence for an association between sedentary behavior and weight status, as well as limited evidence for a dose-response relationship. So sedentary behavior may not significantly impact the development of obesity. However, coming back to one of our mechanisms, right? We talked about improved energy balance, so the coupling of intake and output. So that's what this quote is addressing. It's from a 2006 article, and I'm going to just focus on the highlighted parts. So energy intake is in exact homeostasis with energy expenditure under conditions of high energy expenditure. So all that means is if I'm under high energy expenditure, right, I'm very active, and then energy intake is balanced with energy expenditure. However, when a person does no physical work, the body will not recognize that it is being overfed. Okay, so that's that uncoupling. And this is some, I don't remember if this is data or theory, so excuse me, I'll have to go and review. Essentially, this is what we think may be happening. So if you're doing light, medium, heavy, or even very heavy work, we expect that your energy intake will be balanced with your energy expenditure. But when you're not active, so when we're in this sedentary zone, we think that that's uncoupled. So we don't down-regulate food intake, even though we're not moving. Okay. Yes, we're almost there, I promise. Sorry, I know this is a bit long. Okay, so the obesity paradox, we've already covered it in the first article we read this semester. The general idea of the obesity paradox is that we see better health outcomes in in a population who is experiencing chronic disease if they have more tissue. So if their weight to height ratio is higher. And that's what you're seeing in this study here. So again, you can pause the video, expand this, make it a little bigger to make it easier to see. But essentially what we see is that low body fat as well as low lean muscle or lean mass is experiences the greatest mortality risk here. And then the opposite is true. So high body fat combined with high lean mass experience the lowest degree of mortality. And this was individuals who were referred for cardiac rehab. Okay, so again, we're looking at a population who is experiencing, at the very least, symptoms of disease, if not disease itself. Um, what I think is interesting here, though, is that if we look at a low body fat, high lean mass population, right? Normally, we would think that that's a really healthy phenotype. Okay, so high lean mass, so maybe a little bit more muscle tissue, a little more bone mineral density, but low body fat percentage. Those individuals actually still had lower mortality than the individuals with high body fat and high lean muscle tissue. Now, remember, this is only for individuals who are already experiencing symptoms of disease or disease. So I wouldn't apply this to a healthy population, but we call it the obesity paradox because normally we would associate obesity with negative health outcomes, but in populations who are experiencing disease, it actually seems to be protective. Okay, I'm not going to go through this. This is just for your information. This is a really cool figure though. So if you're interested in mechanisms and outcomes of uh, chronically positive energy balance, this is a really cool figure. But we've gone over some mechanisms and some figures similar to it in the past, so I'm not going to spend much time there. Similarly here, this is another really great figure. This was created by Dr. Halliday as a way to help you think about what factors are affecting energy balance. And she covers some more sort of niche and interesting areas, right? So we might have appetite inhibiting hormones like PYY, GLP-1, and insulin. And then we might have appetite stimulating hormones like ghrelin. Again, over here, we're looking at satiety, so increased fat mass, I'm going to see increased leptin. And generally speaking, in a healthy population, if we see increased leptin, we're going to see decreased energy intake. We don't necessarily see that in an obese population in individuals who have high levels of adiposopathy or ectopic fat storage. And then obviously you've got to account for resting metabolic rate and fat-free mass. And if you take a minute to stop and think about all the factors that may affect each one of these, right? Lots of factors affect resting metabolic rate. We've talked last week about some factors that affect leptin and other adipokines. This week we mentioned ghrelin is associated with resistance training, aerobic training, and sedentary behavior. We talked a little bit about GLP-1s this week. So when you get into it, you can start to see how that map that we looked at, let's see, I'll pull it up real quick. You can start to see how it gets really messy really quickly. So hopefully we've given you some ideas of how physical activity impacts obesity and what recommendations might be, but know that this is an extremely complex issue and you can't, it's pretty impossible to learn it all. Ask Dr. Halliday, she's been doing it for a long time. So, all right, we're gonna give you a 5-minute break and we will come back and just do some article specific information. I don't think that'll take more than about 10 minutes and then you can get to your reading.